This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of October 23rd, 2023. And it seems like it's been a long time since I did a podcast about TV antennas. And I guess that kind of makes sense because TV antennas themselves haven't changed a lot. We talk a lot about the next generation of television broadcasting and whether or not that's actually even going to happen. And maybe it won't. I don't know. But TV antenna technology hasn't changed a whole lot. Still, it's worth taking a few minutes to understand what it is and what it does and exactly where we go from here and why the TV antenna that you have on your roof still works today after 50 years and why the TV antenna that you buy today at Solid Signal is still going to work in 50 years. First, a bit of a disclaimer, because there's a few people who are going to listen to this podcast and are going to have the urge to send me long, complicated emails explaining exactly how I was wrong on every single point. And I get that. But folks, this is not a physics lecture. What this is an attempt to try to help average folks understand antenna technology. And to that degree, I'm going to simplify some stuff. I am going to even potentially mischaracterize some stuff from a strictly math point of view in order to help folks understand what antennas do and what they do not do. So please be kind when you leave the comments. If there's something that you think I've gotten so wrong that there's nothing more that you can say about that and you just have to pipe in, well, then do it. But understand, like I said, I'm trying to make this simple for your average person to understand. So here we go. Let's go. A TV antenna works from a very, very common principle that was discovered about 150 years ago. And it's very simple. It starts with the idea of lightning. Lightning is electricity that travels from place to place. We all know the story of Benjamin Franklin went out in a rainstorm and believing that electricity and lightning were the same thing. Static electricity had been known at that point, but it wasn't really clear that it was the same thing as lightning. So he was able to prove, supposedly, that static electricity and lightning are the same thing by flying a kite in a rainstorm and having a key in a jar start to glow from the electrical charge that came from it. Now, there's some questions about that because it's very hard to duplicate that experiment without killing yourself. So there's some question of exactly how he did it, and maybe he just got lucky. But that's not the subject of this podcast. But at this point, it's the end of the 18th century, and we know that electricity can move from place to place through the air. It's not really known at this point how and why. That's going to take about another 50 to 60 years. So what happens is, in the mid-1800s, there's this huge technological explosion. Why? Because you got the telegraph. Instead of having people who are working completely independently, having no idea of any work that was done in the last 5 years because it hasn't been published and hasn't made it into books wherever they live that were traveling over using boats and horses and whatever, all of a sudden you can get information very, very quickly about what's going on. And it drove this huge amount of technological innovation. And that's where you had a lot of people who were working on electrical theory, people like Volta and Ampere, whose names you know in the basic measurements that are used for electricity. There's also this guy named Lee De Forest in the United States who was responsible for understanding how electricity can be used to carry signals. And that's a really critical thing. The very idea that you can take the characteristics of a kind of electricity, bounce it through the air for a reasonably long period of time, and then have those same characteristics when it travels through a receiving antenna is huge. And all broadcasting is based on that. So he also discovered a lot of the characteristics, a lot of how this works, and he and other scientists began to formulate a theory of how broadcasting could work. One thing that we know at this point, in the mid-19th century, almost to the late 19th century, is that electricity will travel through the air if it's powerful enough. It takes a lot more electricity to get anything to travel through the air than it does to get it to travel through something made of a metal like steel or copper or something like that that is conductive. Not only that, we also have discovered at this point that the amount of electricity in the air goes down very, very, very quickly because of the resistance of the air. However, we have also discovered, and it was, like I said, it was some of these early pioneers eventually leading to Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian inventor, who discovered exactly how to have some sort of signal travel through the air a long distance and still maintain its essential characteristics. That it's not necessarily the amount of electricity that's being used, because the amount of electricity being used can be really, really, really small. By the time a signal gets to your house, it's just like thousandths of a watt. It's not that. It's the characteristics of that signal being preserved, whether that's analog or digital, or in Marconi's case, it was just simple, on and off kind of thing, because that's all he was interested in. A lot of people think that Marconi invented the radio, like boom, all of a sudden you've got voices. No, it was a wireless telegraph first, and work on getting voice into radio didn't really happen until the early 20th century. But when it did, there was another huge explosion of technology, because wow, the idea that you could send voice from one point to another without a wire just literally changed the world. It changed the world of boats at sea and people who didn't have wires running to their house otherwise. It came at a time that a lot of people were putting electricity in their home, and the only reason they were doing it was so that they could have light. And all of a sudden now they have radio too, which is really, really, really amazing. And that, needless to say, led to research on television, that led to research on cellular technology and Wi-Fi and all the sorts of broadcasting that we have today. And that's a very, very simplified kind of history of how broadcasting came to be in its current form. Now, talking about the technology, like I said, the idea is that you pump a signal through a massive, massive amount of electricity through a big metal tower. There's nothing super special about the tower other than it's tall, and that electricity passes all the way up to the top of it and goes out through the air. You're talking about 50,000 watts, 100,000 watts, and it diminishes very quickly. Like I said, that's a characteristic of electricity traveling through air, which is that for any given distance, as you double the distance, you lose 75% of that electricity. It's called the rule of squares. But as you get much, much further and much, much further, what happens is the signal gets very weak. Eventually it gets so weak that it cannot be transferred from the air over to something made of metal. This is why you lose reception. In the case of digital signals, which is where we all are with television, really what happens is something before that. It's not just how weak the signal is, it's how the signal compares to the noise around it. There's electrical noise all over the place, and it's made not just by man-made sources like, electrical generation and things like that, but there's just native electricity in the air. Some of it is, left over from the Big Bang, and some of it is just generated as static electricity by moving leaves and stuff like that. There's electricity all over the place. But it's very noisy electricity. It's not organized in any fashion. And so when the signal that comes through is weaker than the amount of noise that's just hanging around, then yes, it can travel through an antenna, but it can't really be used by a digital tuner. And that's something that's much more important when we talk about digital broadcasting. A lot of folks found that there were cases that they were not able to get digital signals when they'd previously been able to get analog signals for that very reason. On the other hand, there were people who were able to get much stronger digital signals, even though they were pretty darn far away, because those signals being digital weren't relied on the amount of signal that you had, just whether or not it was a 1 or a 0. So we've pumped a lot of electricity through the air. It's gotten very, very weak, and it gets to an antenna. An antenna is an extraordinarily simple thing. It's a metal stick. Now, there's some characteristics to it. The size of the metal stick helps it pick up frequencies at, specific to what you're trying to do. That's why antennas are different sizes. But in the end, it's a metal stick. The electricity hits it, It creates vibrations in the atomic structure of the metal, very, very faint, very, very slight ones that are exactly the same characteristic as the original broadcast. That electricity finds a path of less resistance by going to the metal than it would by continuing on through the air, and therefore you have reception. We say reception, which reception sounds like a very passive word because it is a passive word. TV antennas receive. They don't grab signal out of the air, even though sometimes everybody says that. Even I say that. They receive signal. They sit there and signal comes to the antenna. A lot of things can happen at that point. The antenna signal can be amplified, and amplification happens so that it's easier to send that signal over a wire without even losing more of it. Amplification can't compensate for a signal that isn't there, or a signal that is so weak that it is similar in strength to the noise around it. All it can do is make it easier to travel through that wire so that whatever is there at the site of the antenna gets all the way to your TV. So, looking back again, what we have is the really tall stick pumping out a gigantic amount of electricity that is very quickly diminishing to a very tiny amount of electricity. And as this electricity goes through the air, it ends up hitting a wire, basically another metal stick, an antenna. And because that antenna offers less resistance than the air, then that electricity goes in there. This is all there is to TV reception. I've even made it more complex than it is because there's so little to it. People ask all the time, do you have to plug an antenna in to electrical power? Well, if it's an amplified antenna, yes, but not because of the antenna, only because of the fact that it is amplified. It's the amplifier that needs the electricity, not the antenna. So all of this stuff is as true today as it was when it was first tested in the late 19th century. And that is one of the two reasons why your TV antenna that your grandfather or father or perhaps even you put up in the 1950s works as well today as it did back then. The other half of it is television frequencies. Now, you might remember when TV channels went all the way up to channel 83. If not, you might remember, for example, when they went up to channel 54. But today, TV broadcasting takes place on channels 2 through 36. Now, what's a channel? It's an individual chunk of frequencies. And we separate this big electromagnetic spectrum, which encompasses light and X-rays and radio frequencies and everything. We separate it into chunks because that's useful for us. We can put one thing on one chunk, one thing on another chunk, and all of a sudden you can have multiple channels of television and cell phone reception and Wi-Fi, where if you didn't do that, if you didn't separate it out into chunks, you could only have one thing broadcasting, period. So we have these television channels 2 through 36, and they are the same television channels that were originally set up in the 1940s. They have not changed. What's on them has changed because they used to be analog signals and now they're digital signals, but that doesn't matter to an antenna. An antenna doesn't care what the signal is, only what the frequency is. We design an antenna to pick up a particular frequency based on its length, and that's all it cares about. That's the only thing that matters. So that is why an antenna that was put up in 1955 works today, because the frequencies that it's using are the same. And that's also the reason why if you buy an antenna today at Solid Signal, www.solidsignal.com, it's going to work for the next generation of TV broadcasting, if there is a next generation of TV broadcasting. It's just that simple. Don't get fooled into some antennas saying, oh, we're ATSC 3.0 ready. All antennas are ATSC 3.0 ready. That's the end of the story here. We've gone through all of this stuff. We've talked about how electricity was discovered and quantified. We've talked about how broadcasting happens to get from the tower to your house. We've talked about channels and why they're important. And the bottom line is that unless you change the channels, any antenna made per television in the United States is still going to work long-term, period. End of discussion. So if you're looking for an over-the-air antenna, if you're looking to save some money by getting hundreds of channels over the air, I shouldn't say hundreds, because in large markets it's about 120 that you can get over the air. In small markets it's about 60. I should be more precise in that regard. But if you're looking to get tons of channels over the air for free with buy once, never have to pay for it again TV antenna, well then shop at solidsignal.com for the antenna that you're going to find. You're going to find only quality stuff there, top-notch stuff from the major manufacturers. And this is you're going to find the best selection and, more importantly, the best technical support. If you have questions about an antenna, what you might need, call the experts at Solid Signal. 888-233-7563 is the number. That's 888-233-7563. Tell them that you listened to a 16-minute podcast that confused the heck out of you and you just need some help picking an antenna. They'll take care of you. Anyway, that's about it for this Solid Signal podcast. Have a great one. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Makes me look good to my bosses. And I will see you again next week on the Solid Signal podcast.